These fabrics have been wonderful to sew with. Just look at those beautiful log cabin blocks hanging behind me. Now this is only 4 of the 20 blocks I made. Each of them finish out at 13 inches. And I cannot wait to get the whole quilt together. But first I wanted to continue talking about these log cabin quilt blocks that we started in the last video, but to then take it on to the next step of making these blocks, and they are gorgeous. And there's a lot of tricks and tips to making a log cabin. There's a lot of personal preferences. But I want to show you some different ideas so you can find the favorites that work for you, that are going to help you make the best possible log cabin quilt block. I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise, and I really do love these fabrics. Oh my goodness. And the log cabin block is so perfect because all the different colors, all the different fabrics can stack against each other and look wonderful. And check out that contrast between the background and the focal fabrics. Even though those backgrounds are filled with prints and color, they still allow those gorgeous, fabulous focal fabrics to stand out and really get our attention. Okay, so it is time to quilt. I am ready to go. I want to show you how to make these blocks, but first, please, if you would, subscribe and give me a thumbs up, and we're going to get started quilting. Oh, and one more thing. Karen never claimed her prize for the rotary blade. So Karen, if you're out there watching, make sure you get in touch with me before end of day on Saturday, the 16th, because if you don't claim your prize, somebody else will get chosen. So y'all watch the comments. If you don't see any announcements, I will go ahead and draw another name on Sunday, and that'll be Sunday the 17th, just so we're clear. And I'll make an announcement. We'll actually do a video on Sunday for the new winner, because I don't want anybody to miss out or have to wait longer than necessary. Okay, terrific. Here we go. Let's quilt. As with any quilting, there are always multiple ways to do something. And in putting my strips together, I use a method for quick quilting. And I like to do continuous quilting, or continuous I guess chain stitching is the best way to put it. Now, with log cabins, a lot of times folks will pre-cut every strip and just pick them up and run them through. And that can be very quick. I just don't want to do all that cutting ahead of time. And because I'm using so many different fabrics, I want it to be more random. And if I pre-cut them all, I'm going to tend to do them all probably in very similar fabrics or similar rotation of fabrics. And so I'm doing this different. Like I said, I haven't made a log cabin quilt in 20 years. So everything I'm doing is trial and error at this point, just to see how it works. So step 1, I want to take my 2.5 inch strips by 20 inches and sew them all together. And I'm going to do that end to end. One thing that I can do is take my block like this, my strip that I've pre-cut, and put this right here, seam it, and we've got a straight seam. And that's wonderful, and that works fine. But I want the colors when they fall within the strip. The reason I'm putting these strips together in one piece is I just want to sew them. I don't want to stop and cut between every block. I just want to sew, sew, sew. And if I have straight cuts between the strips where they're joined, I'm going to have an abrupt line. That's fine, because the log cabin has a lot of 90-degree angles. I want these strips to be more blended. I don't want someone to look at this block and say, oh, look, there's an extra line right there. It's not important, but for me, it's about aesthetics. I just like the look of it sort of blending together. So I'm going to sew these strips at an angle on the bias, just like I would if I were doing my binding. And I recently did a video on how to do machine binding, and I show this particular step in a little more detail if you want to watch that. So what I do is I put my first strip down and I put it, laterally across, and then I put this one in the opposite direction. The two things I want to make sure is that I have a little bit of fabric here and a little bit of fabric here. And the reason for that is when I cut these, I was very accurate cutting my strips, but I didn't necessarily trim all the ends off except where I cut the selvages. So there may be a little bit of flexibility here that I have to account for. Now, the other thing that I do is if you look right here, as I'm sewing these together, I line them up so that I have just a little bit of overhang there and there. That way I know I'm not going to come up short or come over here and go, oops, my fabric's way over here, and I'm not going to get a straight sew. And then once I have this figured out, if you look on the other side, then, well, I'm trying to hold it up, you can see that I've got plenty of fabric visible. But notice how this is sort of narrower than that. This is just a way for me to do a double check. And it works and it's effective for me. Again, I'm showing you ideas to think about. I'm not telling you what the best way or even the right way is, for goodness sakes. There are too many options to choose one. So you find what works for you and you go with it. Step one then is to put my needle right here because I'm going to sew from this corner to this corner to get my diagonal. And I'll show you how all that's going to work. So I first get my needle tucked in there, and then I know that I'm going to sew to this point here. Again, I get that little notch. So by having this overhang, it allows you to see exactly where you're going. If you're more comfortable, you can put a dot here so you can see it more visibly. But what I do, since we only have this couple inches, I'm just going to line my needle up right here. And if you line your needle up where you're headed versus watching your needle, then you're going to find a lot better accuracy. Because if you watch your needle, you kind of tend to maybe waver a bit. This way you're going in one consistent direction because you're following that spot. And this is a good way to learn how to sew straight if you're having troubles with that. Just set your aim for a certain point. And don't get caught up with getting, trying to eyeball it or following lines. Just kind of work at it and you'll get there. So again, I line my corners up. I put my needle right in there in the little notch, set my thread, and then I find my point, which is right here. And I like to see it because that's where I'm aiming. And I get right on it, and we're going to do this one right here. And I'm going to turn that because it's not lined up exactly. Just sometimes that little bit of a turn gets me right where I need to be. Okay, so this is going to be my final piece. Now, I do sew multiple strips of these together, and because I'm using, I think there's 4 or 5 of these particular fabrics in this group, I'm going to just show you how I cut these at an angle like this. So I have my certain number of fabrics, whatever it may be, and then I kind of mix them up so that as I sew each set of strips, they're in a different order. Again, I kind of go to an extra degree about how the fabrics fall. That's kind of an important thing for me. I don't like repetition where someone can stand back and say, oh, look, every time you see that fabric, you can see that fabric. And, I remember that from high school listening to music. How many times did we hear our favorite song come on, and then we knew exactly the next 2 or 3 songs that was coming? It's that kind of thing for me. So I just want to make sure there's some good repetition. So we have that. We now have a strip, and I finger press these as I sew, but I just want to show you how nicely these line up, how nice this looks. So instead of having a join like this, where there's an abrupt transition between 2 fabrics, I just like this better. I think it works. And for me, like I said, it's all about aesthetics. So now you know how to make your strips. So go ahead and get all your strips cut. And then we're going to go to the next step. We're going to start making blocks. with 6 blocks completed in the first video that you saw, I have 14 more to go in order to get my 20 blocks for this quilt. So I'm just going to strip piece these, chain stitch them, however you want to call it. It's sort of a combination of both. What I do want to show you is for this next round is I have all my pieces sewn together, all my strips. And then what I did though at the beginning is I took leftover pieces from what was left of the previous strips and sewed them together. So as you're going along, if you come up with an end that's too short, you can either stop and add another piece to it, or just put all those little pieces to the side and sew them together later on. Now, this allows me then to just do a straight sew from here to here. I'm using 2.5-inch strips, or excuse me, 2.5-inch squares for my center, and I am using the same center throughout. The traditional log cabin always used a red block because this was the chimney, the hearth of the home, and the log cabin represented the home. And so there was a lot of symbolism in how this was put together. So I do like to keep it constant. I don't necessarily do red. There's nothing wrong with that, but that just doesn't work for what I'm doing here. So I lay my first piece down, and then I'm going to lay my second. I do want to show you one... I do want to show you one quick tip about sewing with a long strip and a short square. Particularly when you're sewing strips like this, we want to make sure we finger press as we go. Feed dogs are there to move your fabric along. And generally speaking, they do exactly that. There's no general about it. But there are times when we need to kind of manipulate that a little bit in order to avoid more fabric on the top or the bottom. And if the feed dogs are working primarily on the bottom, we're going to get a little more pull on this fabric than we are on the top because this pressure foot is smooth and it's just moving along as we go. Now, that's why we use the walking foot when we're doing a lot of layers or a lot of thick layers or we're doing our quilting. In this case, a walking foot would be sort of overkill. It's unnecessary because there is a way to work through this. When I'm working on sewing 2 strips together, so let's say I'm sewing these, I'm going to hold it here and I'm going to hold these 2 here. And that's going to make sure my fabric is being fed in evenly. In a situation like this with little pieces, it doesn't quite work that way. Now we're only going a short distance, so the situation of a problem arising is pretty slim, but this is a great opportunity to show you this trick. As you're sewing along, if you just let your fabric feed through on the bottom as the feed dogs take it, you're going to find that when you turn your block over, so I'm sewing along and I go to turn this over, you may get a little bit of a ruffle, not a lot, but you see some sort of waves in there, and that's because there's more fabric in there. And that becomes a problem, particularly in a log cabin when you go to press it, and when you go to sew your next strips, you're not going to exactly have a good square, and your fabric may be difficult to work with, particularly when you get out to the longer pieces. So let me show you let me do it this way before I put a block in there. If I'm sewing and I just let it go through, you see the fabric just lays nice and smooth, which is great. What I like to do is put my finger here and just notice I'm not pulling super hard, but I'm just going to put my finger and just hold it. See how it's just a little nudge. Instead of this being lifted up and high, I know it's all relative, by holding this down, it's keeping it closer to the surface that I'm sewing, and it just will keep it nice and smooth, so I'm not going to have any ruffles. I feel like I'm teaching Quilting Physics 101. Sorry, I hope that's not too much, but it works for me. And since I'm doing the quilting and I want to show you what does work, I'm going to show you these silly little things along the way. And I'll tell you, lots of silly little things do add up to a big difference. So we're going to add that here. Now, notice I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch between my blocks. That's another fudge factor because I'm going to hand cut these as I finish. I'm going to cut along the 2.5-inch block because I know that's an accurate square. And if this fabric was a little this way or some, whatever, something can happen, then I may not have enough fabric to get a good clean cut without interfering with what's happening on the other side. So if I put these exactly like that together, I go to cut this, something might get wonky, so I leave just a little bit. It doesn't take much. And I'm just going to sew through. I really like when this falls in a corner. It looks like I went to a lot of trouble to put in a half square triangle. No, not the case. Just sewing along happily and getting everything put together. And so once I get my 14 all finished, then we can move on to the next step. So let me go ahead and get this completed. And with all 14 of my center blocks sewn to the first strip, I'm going to cut them apart. Now, you can use your little, short scissors here at the sewing machine, but I prefer to use a larger pair of shears because I want to get a good clean cut. I don't want to have to cut it a couple times because every time you go to do that, you're moving it, and this is going to be off. And I know everything I'm talking about is really nudgy little things, but all those things do add up to bigger problems later on. And if you find you have trouble with different parts not lining up, think about what you're doing that may be making a difference. Now, I have my super duper Dressmaker shears. I love Gingers. I don't know if you've used these scissors before, but they last forever. This is what my mother used, my grandmother used, so it's sort of in my blood. I can't use anything else. So I have my little ones that I keep handy. They're great. They work for short stuff, little bit quick cuts, whatever the case may be. If I'm doing a lot of cuts, I'll use this. They're incredibly sharp. And of course, if we're quilters, we also have to have a pretty pair. And every year they come out with different colors. And this is my color, so I really like it. So this is the pair of Gingers I'm going to use today. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut right across here. And I'm going to cut just a tad down. This way I can make sure as I'm sewing along that I have plenty here. Now see what I'm talking about in these little areas? I'm going to cut right down in between here. If it's easier for you to draw a line, that's fine. And one good way to do it is just to have a little ruler here, and you can line it up. And like I said, I wouldn't do it right next to this because if this fabric underneath your bottom fabric is pulled just a little bit one way or the other, you could end up short. But you can draw a line here if that helps you cut it. Now, I'm going to cut all these apart. All right, with my blocks cut, and this is my center 2.5 inch, and I added a 2-inch strip to it because that's going to be my narrow. And then I'm turning it with the center block down. The easiest way to get confused on a log cabin is to not be consistent. And you want to make sure you're adding your logs in one direction or the other. I find clockwise is so much easier. So I'm going to put my first block on, then I'm going to put that seam up at 12 o'clock, straight towards my needle. That way, as I'm sewing, I'm going to go this way. Then when I do that, the most recent seam goes to the top, and I'm going to sew this way. So as long as I keep things in order, then I know I'm going to have an evenly sewn block with the right number of strips or logs in each direction. So here I am with my first. Now I'm going to lay, excuse me, my 2-inch right here. Now see how that's just a little bit off right there? That's why I always leave myself a little bit of fudge factor in there just to make sure everything is good. So I have my seam at the top. I'm going to open it up and I'm going to lay this down. And I'm going to rely on this block as my straight edge. And you can see that that protrudes out a little bit right here. But I'm not worried about that because this is the line that I'm sewing along. again, if you're not comfortable doing this kind of chain piecing and just continuously going without trimming, then please definitely go back and cut each piece, trim it down, or even draw a line where it needs to be, whatever works for you. I don't want you to end up with a crooked block simply because you were trying to do something you weren't comfortable with. This is something I'm able to do because I've done it a lot. And I'm trying to show, ways to catch errors as well as get it done in a reasonable amount of time. So I am going to set my thread nice and where it needs to be. Set my needle right there. Make sure I've got my seam allowance lined up. Get my needle in, then I come down here and I make this line up. Now the other thing is I'm still gently holding on to this, and you'll notice if I just leave it go, see where it's falling right there on the purple. Now just by doing this, I maybe only moved it a thread or two, but sometimes that's all it takes, because if you are letting that build up underneath over a distance, you're going to get a lot of extra fabric. Now, in this particular case, because they're small, it's easy enough to trim that off, but I do this all the time, so I do it every time. And the reason for that is to be consistent. I don't have to think about it. It automatically happens. Now, the other thing is seam allowance. I like the idea of seam allowances going to the outside, but in this particular case, if I do, then I'm always going to be sewing against that. And that slows me down because I have to make sure that gets under there just the right way. So I'm going to finger press this down simply because it's the direction I'm sewing. It's not going to matter because everything is going to be going in multiple directions. So we just want to go ahead and get these sewn as best as we can. We'll get that one there. And now I'm going to sew the next one. And we're going to finger press and see, here's one of the little corners. And see, that looks great. There's nothing wrong with that. It also sort of gives it a little bit of a scrappy look and just adds a little more interest. It's like, oh, what's that tucked in the corner right there? And you go, oh, just a pretty piece of fabric. And so I am going to sort of split the difference here. And I say that in that I have a little extra here, and I want to line this up right down on the edge where I know I'm going to sew. And I'm just going to do my 1/4 inch there. So leave my 1/4 inch, or excuse me, 1/8 inch. Line this up here. Now another thing that sometimes happens when you're sewing, this seam affects your fabric. A seam, when it is sewn into the fabric, will pull those threads into the middle. So it's pulling these two pieces of fabric together tightly, and it's going to sort of nudge everything in. It's going to pull things towards the center. So you can almost get what looks a little bit like an hourglass in the extreme case. That's just for a visual. So what I do when I lay this down, see how that actually it's an opposite of an hourglass because it's that angle sort of goes out. I'm going to line this piece up right where it needs to be, and that's going to fall in place nicely. So just because that fabric wants to go in one direction or the other, don't let it. You're in control. Keep those edges nice and straight. Otherwise, you're going to find that the fabric when you go to lay it out and quilt your top, you're going to have areas where the fabric pulls and may want to, create a stretch in order to get those to meet up. So I hope a lot of this is making sense. These are things that I just think about as I sew, and I can't say I've ever spoken them out loud, so it may be a different way of hearing it. And so I'm going to line this up here. Another thing to double check yourself when you have this block like this, I'm lining this right there on the edge because I know that's right there. This one is not so much. So as you go, if you just want to trim this off, if that makes you a little more comfortable, so when you come around that bend, you're not going to have extra fabric, you can do that too. So these are just some ways to help work along as you go to keep things nice and straight. Because the straighter your blocks are, the easier they are to sew and the better they turn out. You're going to get nice, even blocks that look terrific. So we're going to keep going here. We'll finger press that down. And let's go right there. All right, let me finish sewing these and we'll come back and we'll get the next round taken care of. My blocks are all cut apart. The first round is half finished. I have the light colors. Now I'm going to add the dark colors. And I have a total of 14 that I'm going to make. I've divided them up into 3 groups. So this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just because I want to mix the colors up, I'm dividing them up that way. Now, in order to determine what your next block, I'm just going to put this on the bottom because that triangle may confuse things. We start with a 2-inch square, a 2.5-inch square that'll finish at 2 inch, and then I sew a 2.5-inch strip to that block. Then it gets turned this way. See, I'm turning clockwise. Then it gets turned this way, and I'm adding the next strip. And I'm going to sew along from one end to the other. Now I'm going to turn this way and sew the next strip. These are my lights, and then this side is going to be the darker colors. And I'm going to use a green fabric for this particular one. Now, there comes a point where I like to put my fabrics in the easiest way I can sew them, that they will, fall without a lot of adjustment from me. So I could put this here and go this way. Those seams are all going down, so that would be very easy to sew. Or I can put this down and I can place this on top. But remember now, I'm going around. This is the side. And so I would turn it this way, and that means that block's going to go that way. It doesn't really matter. It's all going to sort of come out in the end. At this point, because these are still on the smaller side, I'm going to keep this to the bottom. I don't have to worry so much about the rippling effect because that happens more on a straight piece. When you have a seam in there, that tends to kind of hold things where they need to be, and you have less, whoops, sorry, I bumped the camera, and you have less chance of it messing up on you. So I'm going to line up along my center block here because that's my square, and I'm going to extend just the littlest bit. I'm going to take my 1/4 inch seam, set my thread, and I'm going to line up along the center block, and that will line me up where I need to be here. And I'm just going to go straight through. And then as I get there, I'm going to get my next one in. And I'm just going to fit this. Now see, I stop far enough back that I know when I slide this in, I'm going to have that space there. I always want to keep that space so I have room to cut and allow, with, like I said, a little flexibility, what I call my fudge factor. And because that wants to pull that way with the seam, I'm just going to pull this in, make sure it lines up where it needs to be. I'm keeping everything where it needs to fall. I'm using these fingers to guide my fabric, but what you don't see is I have my thumb down here. So as my fabric is coming up, and if it gets twisted or pulled, my thumb is keeping it in line. It's helping to keep it straight. If you just let your fabric kind of go every which way, it's going to be hard to keep a good straight line. And that's what also helps with speeding things up, is that everything is good to go as you sew. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this row, and then we'll get the next round on, and then row 1 will be finished for both sides. These 5 blocks are all sewn with the first green side. I'm going green on these, and I sew them with the green strip down, these on top, I cut them apart, and I'm going to lay them just like this, because then as I open it up, remember I have the seam that I just made here. I have my center, I have block 1, 2, 3, and now 4 will go this way. So if you remember, just to go in the same direction, you're going to fall in the right place. Now, for something like this, again, we're going to sew here. You need to consider how you want to have everything fall. And for me, the seam allowances are going there. That's fine. But the question is it easier for me to go this way with this on top or this way? And then I can just sew those seams. But for now, because this is such a small piece, I'm going to have it go this direction. And I'm going to use a piece with not so many small strips sewn together, because there's a lot of small pieces here, and I can go ahead and use a longer piece, and that'll be beneficial. So these seams are going down. I know that's going to be easy, and that's going to affect my decision on which direction I'm going to sew my strips, because, easier is better. If I go the other way, some are going to flip up, some will flip down, and that's just something that I have to watch. So, I almost lost my scissors. As I'm sewing this, I do hold this one down, because otherwise it's loose, and see how it can feed in there? And that too is part of the reason why I may, on the next round, very likely sew this with the blocks on the bottom and the strip on top. So I have this, I'm going to open it. I have 1, 2, 3. This is going to be my next round, and I know that because my center block needs to be in the middle of these 4 strips. So I'll have 1 row, 1 row, 1 row, and then this row here. So I'm just going to slide this in so that those seams are going to go down. I'm going to line it up. Again, I'm using my center square on these initial strips that I'm adding around the center, just to make sure everything is nice and even. And where I have a little bit of overhang, I'm going to do that all the way through. So where I have a bit of overhang, I'm going to let that overhang all the way down, because otherwise I may end up with an uneven block. Then I'll cut these apart, and we're going to add another row. And that's all we're going to do, is continue adding rows all the way around. And we'll do this set of green just to give you a good idea of how this works. So let me get these sewn, and we're going to be ready to go for the next round. On these blocks finished, we are good to get these trimmed up. And let me show you how we're going to do that. Now, the first thing to check is it's always a good idea to know where your seam allowance is. And I'm noticing I'm probably taking a little more seam allowance than I generally do. And I think that's just because there's lots of pieces going on. But that being said, I'm still getting a 2-inch square here in the middle, which is great. So I tend to take a scant quarter, so I'm sort of in the normal range. But you want to be able to measure from side to side, and this center should be 2 inches. And that tells you that you're on track, and that's the first step. Now what we want to do is measure the outside edges, and you here and there, and this is caused from where I leave that space, that little eighth inch or so space between my blocks as I'm sewing them, chain stitching them together. I have this room to cut them. And so what I'm going to do now is trim this up. This block finishes at 2. This one is a 2.5 inch. It will currently measure 2.25 inch until I take this seam. This measures 2 inches when I cut it. It'll finish at 1.5, but right now it measures 1 3/4. Should measure 6 inches square. And so I have it lined up on my grid. I'm using the grid lines. And if I put that at 6 inches and that one at 6 inches, then I am spot on. So I'm just going to come in and clean up these edges. This one's already good up there. I just need to trim off this corner and that little dog ear. And now let's see, and we have 6 and 6. Well, it looks like the other side is already good. I have 6 inches all the way around, so that's wonderful. That's going to make that easy. Here, I have a blue one. Let's go ahead and do a blue one. We'll check this one out. So again, you notice I'm retracting my blade. For those of you who get worried about me swinging it around, I'm trying to be more careful. I do appreciate your warnings. And so right here, I've got a 2-inch. And what I do is I'll just tuck my ruler right in here, and I'll see that it's on the 2-inch. Actually, this one's just a tad below, and that could be just the way I ironed it. But this is 2 inches. And so again, I want this to measure 6 inches from each side to side. I should have a square. I'm going to line this up in the corner here. So I'm just going to cut the sides so I have it nice and straight. And let's cut this side as well. I'm not a crossover cutter. Cutting like this is dangerous, number one, but it's also very inaccurate because you're leaning, your blade is going in different directions, so don't try and do that. Besides, I don't want you to lose a finger. Those ends, I want to make sure I'm over here not cutting off too much. And then I'm going to trim this right there. Get our 6 inches on this side. And I'm going to do the same thing here. So this is nice and straight, but it's this side that I need to trim up. Since I know this one's coming up a little narrow, I'm going to leave a little extra space there when I cut this because I don't want to cut that part short. And then when I come to sew here, I'm going to see that this is coming over the edge a bit so that this will come in at a little narrower. Let's do another one that may not be messed up. Let's see if we can find one that's in better shape than that one was. Okay, again, 2 inches in the middle. I have 6 on both sides. I'm good there. And where am I here? All right, this one has a little flare to the side. So the end pieces are the ones that are going to more than likely be angled out. And I know that from my sewing. When I'm sewing a seam, it is not uncommon. I'm just going to trim that a little bit. It is not uncommon for me to get narrow as I approach the end. So great 1/4 inch, boom, I'm getting off and I tend to go out. I know I do that, so I have to compensate for that in an effort to try and not do it, but also when I'm cutting, realize what's going on. So as I put this here, everything is within the 6 inches, but I do have a little bit coming out on the ends, so I'll take care of that. And this, we're only cutting off a little bit, but the reason that it's important is we want our final square to work out. We want it to be square and not have, angled sides, so that when we put our blocks together to make our quilt top, oh, it's going to be a breeze. This little bit of work makes such a difference. All right, now let's see. Are we 6 inches going in this direction too? Yeah, that was the side that's good. Okay, so now you know how to trim these. Get them all trimmed, and then we're ready to add row 2 on. We're getting close. These blocks are trimmed and ready to go. So now I'm going to add the light stripe first. And the reason I always put the light in first is that's going to be the least amount of fabric as opposed to the second set that becomes the most. So I want the darker blues and greens to be dominant, so I'm putting those as the last row, the last half of the row, and then I'll have more of that color. So when I want to create some different designs, then the dominant color is going to be more focal than the lighter background, and they'll recede. So let me go ahead and I'm going to get some, let's see, I need my lights here. Let me grab those. And again, we talk about where to start. This is our center. We did 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to start here in the same place. I'm just going to slide this over and I'm going to put this down this way. There's no right or wrong. just because I think it's easier, I'm just going to sew from the back side on this, because then I don't have to worry about which way the seams are going. So let me go ahead and I'll do this one. Now, as I'm doing the chain stitching here, you can certainly decide to change up the fabrics. So if I didn't want each of these to have this same print, I could just cut there, put the next, pair of fabrics in, and we're good to go. But I'm okay with this because there's enough color going on that this is all going to be mixed up throughout the quilt anyways. So I'm just going to head and sew all these together, and I'll be right back when I'm finished. My first strip of round 2 is attached, and I want to show you how you can tell. This is your center block. Here you count out 1, but here you count out 2. So we know the next one will come here. You always look for the next larger size strip. And so I'm going to take this one right here and just sew this on. And again, I think I prefer doing it this way because then I can just, sew over these seams, and I know I have pretty much a straight edge underneath. So let's go ahead and do it this way. It just seems to be a little easier to manipulate and to manage. I want a little bit of fabric under there, so if something's off, then I have some fudge factor room to work with. And I'll put that here. And again, I do just I keep my hand on this lower fabric. Like I said, I'm not stretching it, but just to hold it in place so it's not flopping around. Now, this is a decision that you just need to think about. Do you want to go up or down? And I'm going to bring this up this way because these intersections, these seams here, will make it bulky. Plus, when I come around the other way, it'll just be easy. So there really is no right or wrong. It's whatever works in the moment, because ultimately you're going to be going around in every direction, and they're going to go every which way. It's just sort of the nature of what we have. And I'm just going to go ahead and sew this row on, and I'll be back when we're ready for the next round. With this first strip of the second row sewn on, I'm going to cut the blocks apart. And I do want to show you just when I'm cutting these, and I'm cutting them when I'm sitting down versus with a ruler, I will just come right in here and cut across. But what I want you to see is I'm holding the fabric up with this finger, because if I spread my fingers out and there's nothing to hold it, see how things just sort of spread? This way, if I have that finger right underneath, it's holding everything where it needs to be, so I can actually see that center and have a better chance of hitting on the mark, so to speak. So sometimes there's just little things along the way that can help make it easier, and that's one that works for me. 3 rows completed. The center block again, and I'm going to turn this way just so we can count in the same manner as we have. So this is our center. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4, then 5, 6, 7, and 8. And again, you can tell we're at an even point. Everything is laid out correctly because from the center, we can count out 2 rows in each direction. And so that's always a good way to check where you are. If you find out, like this is the last row, if you find out as you're counting, you only have 1 row here, that's going to remind you that's the next point. So just keep a little, I'm going to print, or what do I want to say? I'm going to prepare like a PDF download, just a page that you can print out that is sort of a pattern guide, a map of sorts, and I'll number the different blocks so you can get used to going in the same direction and where to place your next block. I think that'll make it a bit easier. I tend to keep one close by for myself as well at times, especially when I'm working on a lot of different ones. Now, The other thing is, remember we talked about using 2 different size strips. So here we have the 1.5 inch finished, and these will finish at 2 inches. Now, my plan is to have on each side now, remember we're dividing it down the middle in light and dark. And on this side where I have 1 row of 1.5 inch, I need to do the same on the other side in order to have an even square. It doesn't have to be in the same row, it just has to be on that opposite side in order for it to balance equally. Now, if you don't care if your blocks are even or not, in that this is in the center of each, you can, skew it any way that you want, and that's fine too. But I do want to keep mine square with the blocks in the middle. That way, I think it's going to give me a little more variety in the way I can lay the blocks out. And I have an idea of what I want to do with these. I'm really excited about. So, first thing now, we are going to go ahead and do our lights. So we already have our 2 rows of darks and 2 rows of lights. My next row is going to fall right here. And again, I'm going to put these in with the strip facing upward. And then I'm going to turn these over, because remember, this is my first side that I'm going to sew right there. I'm going to sew that, and I'm going to put it right here and sew through. So I'm going to do that for all 14 blocks. Then I'll come back, I'll do the second round, and then I'll touch base with you when we're ready for the third to add that final row of color. Look at all these beautiful colors. I love it. These blocks are wonderful. Let me just show you a few here. Obviously, this quilt isn't getting finished today. I took a lot more time with this than I anticipated, and I'm so glad I did, because I love how these have turned out. This is going to be wonderful put together. And that's why I want to take some more time, because now that this is done, there's some great opportunities for design in the way we lay it out. So that's going to be our next chapter. I promise that'll be the finish, but oh, I hope you give this a try. This is such a fun pattern, such a fun way. And I'm just talking about log cabin in general, such a great way to use your fabrics. I think we're finished for today. I am so glad you hung in this long. This has been quite an adventure, and I'm really excited about it. Thank you for being here. I hope you give me a thumbs up and subscribe and come back for the next edition, and we'll have this quilt finished. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.